kind introduction, and good evening, good afternoon, good morning, depending on where you're based, to all of you. Thank you so much for having me to talk about how emerging technologies can help with the prevention and investigation of civilian casualties. Now, before I start, we need to talk about emerging technologies, right? Because emerging technologies really is a catch-all, a kind of umbrella term that includes a lot and isn't quite clear what it does include. Now, my focus, both in my work, as has been mentioned, and indeed in this talk, will largely be on drones, which I'm very aware aren't actually quite as emerging anymore, but they're still comparatively new in many contexts, as we're currently seeing, for example, in the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. And I'm going to mention and talk about AI-enabled systems, especially AI-enabled autonomous systems, usually unmanned systems. I have 2 points, basically, that I want to make over the next 12 minutes or so. But first, I really want to commend you on the choice of topic, because I think it's absolutely crucial and really important that we go indeed beyond the killer robots debate. Using new technologies, unmanned capabilities, artificial intelligence, to build autonomous systems that can kill human beings without human intervention has indeed become possible. And there is absolutely a reason to be concerned about this. But it is also, the killer robots, the lethal autonomous weapon systems, are also the most extreme case that these technologies, how these technologies can be used. Now, analysts and commentators have, of course, a tendency to focus on the most extreme. It captures public attention. It's well, interesting. And I would say that activists actually almost have an obligation to think through the most extreme case. But if this is the main and indeed often only focus of the debate, there is a danger to throw out the baby with the bathwater. And I was reminded of this when I was in the European Parliament about a year ago. I was testifying at the Defense Committee of the European Parliament and was talking about, well, lethal autonomous weapon system, among other things. And the reaction of the MEPs present, at least those that asked question, was really quite extreme, because a lot of them said, well, if this is the danger, we should just not use any of this in a military realm, right? It's really easy. Let's just ban it. Let's not touch it, because it could come to this most extreme case. And I think that this is the wrong approach, like really the wrong approach. And not only because the military, as I'm sure we're going to hear in the panel, has an interest in using new technologies because it helps them do their work, but also because these new technologies may indeed help reduce, limit, or avoid civilian casualties. And some of these weapon systems have specifically been built with this as a primary goal. And that's exactly what I want to talk about today. So how can new tech and how can drones and artificial intelligence in particular help prevent civilian deaths or help investigate civilian casualty events? I think it is helpful when thinking about this to differentiate between 2 different ways that this can happen. And the first is what I would call the indirect or passive way. And the second is the more active or direct way. And this is how I want to kind of look at this. And maybe it's a kind of helpful way of framing it. What do I mean by this? The indirect and passive way is basically how these systems contribute to avoiding civilian casualties or minimizing them just by existing. So basically here we're talking about a positive second order effect. By doing nothing but watch these systems be introduced, there are some positive effects that we can see in this area. Now, let me be very clear. I don't say we can sit back and relax. There are definitely some concerning usages that we should be aware of. But it is important to realize these indirect effects, and I will talk about them in more detail in a second. And the second effect, the other way of looking at this, is indeed the direct or active way. So here we are thinking about how can we use new systems that are being developed for one reason, how can we use these new technologies specifically in order to prevent or investigate civilian casualty instances. So let me start with the indirect and passive way. What are the positive second order effects, if you like, of drones and AI-enabled autonomous systems? I would highlight two effects here. And the first is, well, simply related to the technological specification of these systems. So when we look at drones, for example, there are two things that make drones special, if you like. The first is drones can stay in the air much longer than most, if not all, manned systems, which means that they can be longer over a target. They can loiter over a target. What does this mean practically? Well, it means that we have more information about the target. We can make sure that it's the right target, that it is a legal target. And we, or the military, has the ability to wait for a most opportune moment, the most opportune moment to strike if indeed there is a decision to strike. So, for example, rather than having to engage when a target is in a context where civilian casualties may occur, you can wait with a drone or an autonomous system and strike later when there is less danger for civilians. A second technological fact is that drones at the moment, the current generation of drones, tend to carry smaller weapons and the modern precision weapons, which of course also means that while you can be more precise in your operations. So basically, we have here two technological facts that mean that if and when used correctly, drones can help reduce civilian casualties. Now, of course, this if and when used correctly is a crucial part of this equation. And in my view, this is really what people, well, such as myself, commentators, experts, activists, etc., should focus on, because this here is the policy question. So we should make sure that these systems are indeed used in a way to minimize civilian casualties. But if you use them that way, that's where you could that's how this could work. Just to give you kind of an example of this effect at work, or indeed an example of this effect not being at work because the systems weren't present. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the 2009 Kunduz fuel tanker airstrike that was carried out by US manned aircraft, but called in by a German commander. So this was a huge political issue in Germany. So just to remind you what we're talking about, so 2009 in Afghanistan, 2 fuel tankers had been stolen by insurgents, and there was a fear that these fuel tankers could be used as bombs, as very, very big bombs. Now, these fuel tankers got stuck on a road in the mud, and what happened was that people went there to draw petroleum, draw gas. Now, a German commander decided to order a strike on these fuel tankers, eliminating the danger of these fuel tankers being turned into a bomb. And these strikes were carried out by American F-15, and they killed, numbers are unclear, but about at least 100 civilians and militants in the process. Now, this specific case has been used a lot in the German drone debate, and I think rightly so. And because the idea here that what it is that Germany at the time was short of airborne capabilities. So they only had a limited amount of airborne capabilities. And in this situation, they had to use the American manned systems, which could only be around for a short while. So basically, we had the most terrible situation for military operations, namely that there was very limited information and time pressure. And this led to an attack that, in hindsight, was a mistake, a fault, maybe illegal. There's a whole debate about this that I don't want to answer, want to enter. So if Germany had drones, given everything I just mentioned in terms of what these systems can offer, it may have been able, the military commander may have been able to be over the target for longer, gather more information. It's very likely that it would not have been a strike at all, or if there had been a strike that was considered necessary, it may have been more precise. It is likely that it would have used smaller weapons than the 2 500-pound bombs the F-15 ended up using. So here, and despite the fact that people arguing that armed drones are causing civilian casualties, they may indeed have helped avoid them. And this is just, to kind of illustrate how this may work. And the second, before I come to the more active uses, the second indirect, and indeed I would say even more indirect way that these new technologies can help avoid civilian casualties is the following. Because of the availability of new technologies, especially autonomous and unmanned systems, states that have these capabilities may be more willing to intervene in humanitarian crises and help avoid humanitarian catastrophes than they would be with other systems. So the idea is that if the availability of unmanned systems allows you to intervene with less risk to you, you may be more willing to intervene in a situation where normally you would not have done so. Of course, we're thinking here about situations such as the genocide in Rwanda or the situation in Darfur. This basically is the other side of these systems are causing more wars argument, because we have heard the argument that if systems allow you to carry out attacks more risk-free for yourself, you may be willing to do so more, and this may lead to more wars. I can see the logic behind that, but the other side may indeed be that these systems allow you to intervene in situations where you otherwise would not have intervened, and where you could avoid civilian casualties, or indeed prevent them from happening. So 2 indirect effects I wanted to highlight. The better and more precise technology allows you to hurt less civilians, if that indeed is your policy goal. Again, importance of the policy goal. And the availability of systems that are cheap in terms of your own costs, both financially, but most important, the human cost, your own human cost, may make it easier to intervene in situations where crimes against civilian populations may be perpetrated. So these were the kind of indirect effects that I think are worth noting, and maybe we can discuss later on. But let me spend the last 5 minutes or so talk about the more direct or more active ways of using emerging technologies, AI and drones, to avoid civilian casualties or indeed investigate them after the fact. And here again, I would highlight 2. Everything comes in 2s today. And the first kind of active way of using this new technology would be in the investigation of civilian casualty events. So here we're talking after the fact. What drones and AI-enabled surveillance as well, via drones or via other means, allows you to do is get to places where you normally would not have been able to monitor situations, and indeed make this whole process of monitoring situations and gathering data much easier and much cheaper. So you can imagine, and indeed we're seeing this, organizations such as the UN using drones, autonomous or not, to monitor conflict situations if it doesn't decide to intervene, but at least monitor, to gather data for when things may come to a trial later on, so that you have the data that allows you to investigate atrocities, civilian casualties, events, and the like. And I think we're going to see much more of that since we have so many more of these surveillance systems in use at current conflicts and in today's conflicts. And the second active way of using the new technology that I think is worth thinking about is the use in conflict, but also more general catastrophe scenarios. Because a lot of the casualties, civilian casualties in catastrophe and also conflict scenarios stem from not necessarily the attack or the event as such, but from the confusion and lack of organization that comes afterwards, right? People don't know where to go. Helpers don't know where to go either, what to provide, all of that. And here, drones in particular can help quite a bit by, for example, bringing internet back on, so bringing whole regions back online after catastrophes. So be it floods or conflict, it doesn't matter. In these scenarios, you could use drones to bring the internet back up, make sure that people can contact helpers that people who want to help can get to those that need help and know what to bring them. So again, this is also an area where a lot of work is done. There are a lot of different initiatives. We're already seeing this being used, but this is definitely an area, I think, where these new technologies can help to prevent civilian casualties after attacks or crises or catastrophes. All right, that brings me to an end. I don't want to bore you for much longer. So I think that there are certainly more ways that emerging tech can help with the prevention and investigation of civilian casualty events. And I'm sure that this all-star panel that we're gonna hear in a second will discuss those. But I wanted to use my time to give you a sense of the different ways that it happened, and show that this is not just about the active ways, let's take this system and use it in a certain way, but there is indeed a kind of positive effect that is taking place because this new tech is being used. And I think that's the kind of good news I want to leave you with, given that there are so many other more dystopian and more horrible ways that these technologies can also be used. And of course, that's something that we all also need to be concerned with. But hopefully this was a bit more uplifting than what we usually hear when it comes to discussing new technologies. Thank you very much for your time. And I'm handing over, I think, to Dr. Larry Lewis, who's gonna moderate the panel.
Great, that was fabulous. Thank you so much. And to your points, the indirect and the direct, we're gonna amplify some of that after the panelist discussion. So I think that's a great framework to think about. So again, my name is Larry Lewis, and happy to moderate this fabulous panel session today. So again, looking at the role of emerging tech in preventing and also investigating, and I actually like to use the word assessing civilian casualties, civilian harm. This is a really important topic as we see the diversification of unmanned systems. We see the pursuit of AI-enabled systems, autonomous systems, swarms, cyber capabilities. You can extend this to a number of different applications, and there's an imperative to use this technology to reduce civilian casualties, both from a legal perspective, but also from a policy perspective. So for example, in the United States, we have an executive order from 2016 on civilian casualties that makes a policy commitment that the United States will seek to use technology to better reduce civilian casualties as well as better identify when it happens. We also have a DoD AI strategy, artificial intelligence strategy, that also commits to using the technology of artificial intelligence to help reduce civilian casualties. So, so today we have a great panel, and we're going to talk about the how do we do that, and how does that work? So if the panelists can all come up, and I'll introduce each of you. So we have 4 panelists today. First is Sean Steen. He is the Senior Advisor for Emerging Technology in the Office of the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Strategy and Force Development within OSD policy for the United States. Among his responsibilities, he is the DoD lead within the U.S. delegation to the Group of Government Experts on Emerging Technologies. So that's the UN CCW group on the area of lethal autonomous weapon systems. He's also the shepherd of DoD Directive 3000.09, which is autonomy in weapon systems. He's a career civil servant who's served in OSD for over 20 years in a variety of positions, both on regional and functional sides of OSD policy. So, John, great to have you here. We also have Eben Ida. She's worked on emerging technologies and the law of armed conflict since 2012. Her first work was her doctoral work on the legal implications of the changes in the human role in target selection and engagement. and she completed that in 2016. And I'd like to get a copy of that. She served as legal advisor to the reserve, to the Admiral Danish Fleet, and the Defense Command Denmark, where she was part of the International Operations Staff. And she did 3 operational employments as staff legal advisor to NATO Operation Ocean Shield, the Danish-led International Coalition for the Removal of Chemical Weapons from Syria, and a similar operation in Libya. She currently holds the position of Assistant Professor in International Law at the Institute for Military Technology, Royal Danish Defence College, where she's been tasked to set up and head a new center of operational military law. Her research looks at the legal implications of emerging technologies, including in particular AI-enabled weapon technologies and decision-making support. She's taught widely on topics related to LOAC and the use of force. She serves as an advisor to the Danish military defense. And she has an upcoming interdisciplinary book on military uses of artificial intelligence. So great to have you. We also have Lieutenant Colonel Matthew Krause, who's a judge advocate in the U.S. Army, currently serving as the director of Future Concepts Directorate at the Judge Advocate General's Legal Center in Charlottesville, Virginia. Future Concepts Directorate is the U.S. Army's focal point for the study of the law in future conflict. His past assignments have included Deputy Staff Judge Advocate of Fort Bragg, Military Advisor to the U.S. Ambassador at Large at the Office of Global Criminal Justice, working on responses to atrocities committed by ISIS and the Assad regime, and Regimental Judge Advocate of 2nd Cavalry Regiment. Yeah. He has served in Iraq, Afghanistan, Haiti, and Europe, and has advised forces in combat. He also is a co-host of the podcast Battlefield Next and has written on international and operational law. He has a JD from Wake Forest University and LLM from the Judge Advocate General's Legal School and Georgetown University Law Center. We also have Colonel Chris Corpola. He is an associate professor and director of the Robotics Research Center at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. Between 2015 and 16, he collaborated with the philosophy program and brought together engineers and ethicists to study just war theory and autonomous weapons. The collaboration resulted in receiving the APGAR Award, West Point's highest teaching award. In 2017 and 18, he testified at the UN, again, the CCW, as part of the US delegation of the Group of Government Experts on Lethal Autonomous Weapon Systems in Geneva. And 2018, Colonel Corpola was selected as a Andrew Carnegie Fellow. He is deployed twice to Iraq and once to Afghanistan. As a researcher, he's coordinated research projects and grants across the US Department of Defense, academia, and industry in the field of robotics, autonomous systems, and artificial intelligence. And he's authored and co-authored over 40 scientific and professional papers, as well as book chapters in the field of autonomous systems and robotics. Great. So it's a wonderful panel, and we're all going to go dark except for Sean, and Sean is going to start off.
Thanks, Larry. Folks, I'm happy to be here today. I will say that I really liked Dr. Franca's remarks, and these will be, we did not coordinate, but these will be very consistent with what she was saying. Let me start by saying that, preventing civilian casualties, and I'm trying desperately to avoid acronyms and so forth, but I work for DoD, so that's hard. But this has long been a U.S. priority. DoD has a long, strong history of law of war compliance. We can point to things like the Law of War Manual, the fact that we have Judge Advocate General officers, JAG officers advising commanders down to the battalion level. We conduct legal reviews of weapons before we field them. As a matter of policy, U.S. forces routinely conduct operations under policy restrictions that are actually more protective of civilians than even is required by the law of war. The very fact that we have outside analysts that have been brought in, such as Larry, to help us assess CivCAS and talk about corrective actions, I think demonstrates the seriousness with which this is taken. To spin off, or to use the language that Dr. Franke used, like the indirect effects that she was talking about would include things like more precision enables the use of smaller warheads or even purely kinetic ones in certain cases, which aren't necessarily done, or at least primarily done, for the purpose of reducing civilian harm. But the smaller warhead has a smaller blast radius, lower collateral damage effects, and the potential for reductions in civilian harm as a result. The military does these for a variety of its own reasons, right? I mean, to include just pure operational reasons, I can carry more of these weapons on a given platform. I could arm platforms that might not be able to carry the bigger weapons, etc. Similarly, advances in things, decision assistance programs, or intel and surveillance platforms. Think of things like Project Maven, but there are other, I'll say, less ambitious, less sweeping initiatives that also improve situational awareness for the commanders so that we avoid unintended engagements. So I just wanted to foot stomp what Dr. Franke calls the indirect effect, right? We often do run into, in discussions of these, especially in the international community, which at least is where I run into them, a focus only on sort of what those downside effects could be without considering the possible upside effects as well. Having said that, we're here today to talk about direct effects, right? The capability development efforts that could help directly reduce civilian harm. And we have some experience with this in DoD as well. An example I would point to would be the ammunition for the counter rocket artillery and mortar, or CRAM system, right? For those of you who aren't as familiar, it's the ground-based version of the phalanx multi-barrel gun system, right? That shoots down incoming mortar and artillery and rockets. This is a development of the close-in weapon system, which is the Navy version, which has been fielded since something like 1980, I forget. In the Navy's case, the ammunition does not self-destruct, right? Any rounds that don't impact an incoming target, frankly, just fall into the ocean. But on land, you are likely to be over either a large installation of your own coalition forces or in a populated area with civilians. So the Army included a requirement, and in fact, the ammunition, the rounds that are fired, self-destruct before they hit the ground. And there's been no recorded case of anyone being injured by those rounds that have gone past the intended target. I use this as an example of how we could focus on emerging technology to improve the performance and the capabilities of weapons systems and support systems, decision support systems, to include civilian harm mitigation as a requirement, right? I work in DoD. I'm in the middle of this. I'm a small cog in a big bureaucratic machine. So I think one of the questions we should look at is, how do we ensure that requirements in the formal DoD sense of, what exactly does this weapon system have to do, what parameters does it have to have, et cetera. How do we ensure that reductions in CivCAS or civilian harm are included among the requirements for these systems? Now, the example of CRAM is a good one in that the self-destruct capability is sort of the next more granular level up from just making sure that we don't harm civilians. There are different ways we can do that, but we need to, in the capability development process, we need to get to that more granular level. Bureaucratically, right, all of these requirements compete with one another, and there's a cost and schedule impact. So another point to consider is that we need to be in a position where we can champion these things, and that they are going to be engaged in this struggle with the other requirements that are levied on this system, and they're going to have to carry the day in terms of cost and schedule. And the last point I would make about this, in sort of going back to the broader point, and this feeds again right into what Dr. Franco was talking about. We really need to avoid being anti-technology, which is an easy thing to fall into in some of these discussions. There are pitfalls and challenges, as she noted, but there are also opportunities here that we could use these, and we should use these better weapons and better capabilities for the purpose of improving military operations, and that includes reducing civilian harm. I haven't been very good about paying attention, so if I have the balance of any time yet, I yield it back to you, Larry.
Thank you, Sean. That was great. So let's go without further ado over to Eben.
Thank you very much. I would like to begin with endorsing Sean's approach to new technologies as them enabling us to enjoy possible benefits from technologies that are originally aimed at increasing military effectiveness. And I think it's really important that we get this message through, especially to the critics who obviously tend to focus on the negative effects of those technologies. So if we can actually come through with the message that military effectiveness and humanitarian protection are not two opposite values, but rather two sides of the same coin, I think we've come quite a long way. And from my perspective, the main benefit of emerging technologies, when we're talking about AI-enabled systems, is the increased or improved ability to make proper use of data that is already out there and available to us, but without help from computers, from machine learning based algorithms, deep learning, and other techniques. It will be very hard for us to make effective use of all this information. And that's, if we can actually make proper use of all the data collected by our ISR systems, sensor suites, and if we can manage to fuse all these different sources of information in order to create improved situational awareness, I think that is where we will see the main benefits, also in terms of protecting civilians and reducing civilian casualties. Also, machine learning will play, the way I see it, a huge role in increasing precision in automated target selection systems, which can not only be used to create automated targeting processes, but also as decision-making support, where we have the ability to combine the superior data analysis skills from computers with human judgment and situational awareness. I think that will generally be extremely beneficial. And I think that we will hear other panelists address that as well. But the way I see it, those are not the only benefits that we might see. There are other less direct benefits from using technology aimed at increasing military effectiveness as well. One thing that is worth mentioning is the use of digital simulation for training purposes that will allow us to prepare our soldiers much better for the environment that is awaiting them on the ground. By using augmented reality, virtual reality techniques and mathematical modeling, we can create, if not completely realistic training environments, then at least something that comes very close to one-to-one training scenarios that will, for example, enable us to practice urban fighting in the streets of Mosul, or that will allow the pilot of an F-35 to train his skills in air combat. So we can prepare soldiers better, and it's generally assumed that if we prepare soldiers better for the task that awaits them on the ground, then we reduce the risk of mistakes, including those that might lead to civilian casualties. So that is one less direct but still quite important benefit that we might harvest from new technologies. Another one is that if we can use new technologies to provide ourselves with alternative or tactical alternatives, we could avoid methods or tactics that generally causes a large number of civilian casualties. For example, the delivery of explosives from the air or shelling of populated areas. Using, for example, small or micro UAVs or swarms or individually, or unmanned ground systems could enable us to solve the problems without having to shell large populated areas. Obviously, it will depend on the setting on the ground, but providing new tactical alternatives is an important contribution of new technologies. However, I would like to end my comments here with raising one concern in relation to solving problems with new technologies, and that is that if we want to use new technology to solve concrete operational problems, including to enhance civilian protection, we need to understand the root causes, or the underlying causes of civilian casualties in the conflict. So the problem here is that, and I've learned that from talking to, among other experts such as Dr. Larry Lewis, that there's a lot of misunderstandings about the causes of collateral damage. So if we don't properly understand why we're seeing collateral damage or civilian casualties in a conflict, then it's going to be really, really difficult for us to use technology to solve this problem. One example could be that if we are seeing a rather high occurrence of civilian casualties in a conflict, and we believe that it is caused by lack of precision in our weapon systems, but really the cause is that we don't have sufficient situational awareness to predict that civilians are indeed nearby the target we intend to attack. Well, then more precision in weapon system is not going to solve the problem. And likewise, if we think that the reason for civilian casualties actually stems from flawed collateral damage estimations, where it's actually caused by misidentification of targets, well, then collateral damage estimation technologies will not solve the problem. There we would need to use technology that will enable us to identify the targets correctly. So we really need a very thorough understanding of what causes the civilian casualties that we are faced with. And if we don't make an effort to understand those causes, then it's going to be really difficult to solve the problem using new emerging technologies. And that is not, that is not a problem that is limited to the military domain. That goes for all problem solving by means of technology. And I think I will end my comments here.
Great, thank you. Matt, can you go ahead for us?
Hey, good afternoon. I hope you can hear me okay. First, I want to just tell you how grateful I am to Lieber and to the ICRC and to the Stockton Center for inviting me on this panel. And particularly grateful to Dr. Lewis and Ambassador Buchwald for reaching out to me. And it's such a pleasure to me to see such a joining of different areas, professional areas, all joining here to talk about such an important issue, not just members of the military, but also members from NGOs, academia, and we're all together talking about this. And I think that right there is at least a small victory. And second, I'd like to kind of confirm as fact something that many of you might have an assumption about. I admit that I am biased when it comes to the issue of civilian casualties. Hopefully that doesn't detract from my credibility too much, but one of the foundations of U.S. Army doctrine is compliance with the law of armed conflict. I have been a tactical legal advisor during combat operations, and I can tell you that I was that guy who lost sleep at night worrying about whether innocent people would get killed because of something that my organization did wrong. So I can tell you that over one particular deployment in Afghanistan, my brigade's combat activities resulted in 0 casualties. And that was in Kandahar, and arguably one of the most culturally significant provinces in Afghanistan and home to some of its largest cities. That result, however, takes a lot of work. And getting to that point is 100% dependent on accurate information about the patterns of civilian life in the battle space. So I would like to continue a theme that Ibn was talking about, which is the critical nature of information during targeting. But I want to talk about something a little bit different though. When we talk about battlefield technology, we think about robots and artificial intelligence and some of the more interesting things that plug in and use ones and zeros and algorithms. But if by technology, we're also referring to that sum of techniques and skills and methods and processes used in the accomplishment of any human endeavor, including war, then it's much more than that, I submit to you all. It's ensuring that all tactics, techniques, and processes are continuously on the table of innovation. So with that respect, I'd like to focus more specifically on advancing and reviewing and constantly improving the way that military forces obtain information in the information age and beyond. Precision weapons are amazing, right? But if they're aimed at the wrong target, as Ibn has said, based on inaccurate or incomplete information, then the only thing that you have done with a precision weapon is you have precisely destroyed the wrong thing. And so there's an old adage that says information drives the battle. And it's not just something that we say, it really does drive what we target. So I'm the director of an Army think tank that focuses on the law of armed conflict and future conflict. So we study autonomous weapons, machine learning, coding the law into algorithms, artificial intelligence, everything else, everything that you've heard in the news. And I'm happy to discuss those topics. But today I want to offer you this. Algorithms can't replace relationships on the battlefield, but could complement them. From a technological standpoint, or from an innovative standpoint, I'd like to see stronger relationships between NGOs and civil society in the combat zone with the military forces that operate there prior to a civilian casualty. So I have seen a lot of engagement at very, very high levels between NGOs and the government, but not as much engagement at tactical levels. By tactical, I mean brigades and below, between military forces and NGOs. So targets are struck at the tactical level, yet information very often comes from non-traditional sources too late. Often we get information and reports about a civilian casualty from a non-traditional source or from an NGO. Wouldn't it be great if we learned about civilian patterns of life from those organizations that have been operating in the area for much longer than the military forces have? So I'd like to see stronger relationships between NGOs and military forces. So, and I fully admit that oftentimes military forces are skeptical of NGOs and vice versa. But technology to me means advancing these relationship processes to make them even better. So I would ask the audience to consider a broader concept of technology and how can we innovate current practices to make the battle zone safer for civilians while still achieving military objectives. And I want to show you one piece of technology that I think that could really help with that. And so I'm holding up this, which many of you might recognize, is a phone. So when military forces deploy to combat zones, they all have them. So we need to take a look at our processes and take a look at the way that we communicate with one another on the battlefield in order to learn as much information as possible about the civilians who live in the battle space. So Dr. Lewis, thanks again for allowing me to be on the panel. And I turn it back over to you, sir.
Great. Thanks, Matt. And over to Chris.
Thank you, Larry. Good afternoon, everyone. And yeah, just really honored to be here on this panel and with our colleagues and the audience in attendance. And just kind of want to describe briefly the lenses that I look at the problems. Of course, I'm an electrical engineer, so most of my work is in these types of technologies. If it's machine learning, if it's training convolutional neural networks, if it's training models and data sets, and leveraging these AI and ML tools for things like navigation and path planning, or identifying objects of interest. It could be roadside bomb, it could be an individual, it could be a combatant and non-combatant, trucks, vehicles, and really using being in the lab and seeing the potential benefits, and of course the challenges that these technologies pose. And then the second lens, of course, as a military officer. So, these are really the perspectives I take, on these problems. I'm not a lawyer, I'm not an ethicist, but of course, many on the panel are, and it's great to get their perspectives. So yeah, so I'm just going to talk briefly, really about. Again, focusing on, of course, AI-enabled systems. We've kind of already hit on the advantages and why the why the military is heavily focused on these, but really looking at we'll look at the perspective of decision making, right? So this could be the individual soldier, right, having to make a decision. That could be to pull a trigger to engage a combatant. It could be a theater level commander that is in a taking months of information and data and all of that being processed and then authorizing an airstrike. So really, these types of systems, of course, enable the best decision with the information at hand. So of course we talked about information. You got incorrect information, but really these aided threat recognition systems that we're investing in are trying to take this preponderance of information, taking multiple sources, right? So it could be the soldier on the ground, it could be the unmanned aerial system in the air, it could be an unattended ground sensor, a vehicle, all of this information, and then fusing that all together to come up with the best picture, right? The best information that they can achieve at that time, and then provide that to to that end user. Again, the soldier all the way up to, the highest decision maker, in that in that theater. So trying to increase, of course, the positivity rate, and I will argue that that a higher positivity rate, of course, is going to increase our the chances or the likelihood of a correct engagement. And then, as Sean has mentioned, if I know exactly that combatant is in a specific room in a specific building, I can select the appropriate effect to engage that combatant without injuring other people potentially in the room or, of course, in the building. So as we know, if we look at drone strikes as an example, right? There's many times those munitions are have a greater chance of increased civilian casualties compared to a smaller munition that will have a much more proportionate and direct effect. So just wanted to of course just highlight that example. I know we've talked about this, but really by having these models, right? So if I have data sets of weapon systems, and then I can identify those combatants, and if I have another image, right? So I have a bounding box around the potential threat. I have another bounding box around a non-combatant, and maybe they're holding a rake or something that looks like a rifle. That that AI-enabled system can assist that end user with building a threat model that would highlight the combatant with a weapon as a higher threat than the civilian. And then, of course, the focus should then that would cue that individual soldier or end user to focus on the combatant. So again, this is I would see this as a of course, as we develop these decision support aids as really a direct method of trying to reduce civilian casualties by building threat models that will cue operators onto the actual threat and not on civilians. And of course, then giving that in knowing that there is a mix, right? In many of these situations, we have a mix of combatants and non-combatants. That the end user is aware that the civilian or the non-combatant is in the same room or in the same building. So one, and Sean had highlighted on some of these larger efforts, right? And I encourage the audience and others to do some searches on these projects, and many are already familiar with them. But one is Project Convergence. So this had in Yuma Proving Grounds last month in September, had a very large demonstration, right? And as you read the articles, and we had the highest levels of the DoD, and like especially, of course, in the Army, that were present for these demonstrations, and they understand the difficulties and the challenges and the brittleness of these AI enabled systems, and some performed poorly, some performed much better than expected. But understanding that we're trying to build that better operating picture, that better overall increasing the information provided to the individuals that are making these decisions. So it's really broken up into a number of areas. I've already touched on aid of threat recognition. Of course, maneuver is very important, right? So having AI assists for maneuver, and then really trying to fuse all of this information together, and then of course building the data set. So I encourage everyone. It was likely the largest AI-enabled demonstration in the DoD that we've had thus far, and another, we'll say, a decision support tool was called Firestorm, which is really kind of a sensor to shooter algorithm where trying to determine what the best effect, a tool to determine the best effect for that given situation. So just one example of really the various efforts, of course, with these types of systems, and where the Army and the DoD is going. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Larry.
Okay, and I think we have a hard stop in 30 seconds. So there's so much more we could talk about. So unfortunately, we need to stop. But I invite you to come back next time in 2 weeks. We'll talk about civilian casualties and partnered operations. Not next Wednesday, but the following Wednesday. Thank you for all the panelists and our keynote speaker, and hope to see you again next time.